Is Russia going to be able to manufacture their own spare parts for their newly gained nationalized Boeing and Airbus fleets? Then what will happen if they actually do that? Today we are going to continue my series about the impact that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is having on the global aviation world, so stay tuned. Last week I did a video about the possibility that Russia was contemplating to nationalize their fleet of foreign leased aircraft that is being operated inside of Russia. And on the 14th of March, that's exactly what happened when Vladimir Putin signed into law the possibility to change the registration of foreign leased aircraft from whatever country they were registered in to Russia. It turns out that a huge majority of these aircraft was actually based in Bermuda. And the reason for that is simply because the leasing companies that own these aircraft preferred to have these aircraft registered under the Aviation Authority of Bermuda to having them in Russia for different reasons. Russia had never been a big fan of that, and to a certain extent I can understand it, because if you have a lot of aircraft operating inside of your airspace out of bases on your soil, it is so much easier if you as an aviation authority has the supervising authority of it. But in this case, this is how the leasing deals were made up. But what happened on the 12th of March was that the Bermudan authority came out and said that in light of the recent sanctions that happened on Russia, they were finding it very difficult to have the safety oversight of these aircraft that they want to do. They couldn't access them, they couldn't see what was happening to them, their maintenance situation and so on. And because of that, they said that from midnight on the 12th of March, these aircraft that was operated by Russian airlines on Bermudan registry would lose their Airworthiness Certificate. An Airworthiness Certificate is basically a paper stating that this aircraft is safe to fly, right? It has been maintained up to international standards and everything, all of the little boxes have been ticked in how this aircraft is being handled. And without an Airworthiness Certificate, you cannot fly the aircraft, and no insurance company is going to insure that aircraft. So that would basically ground all of the Bermuda registered aircraft that was in Russia from that date. After that, Ireland, which is another huge leasing nation, also followed suit and did exactly the same thing. And it is in light of that that the Russian regime on the 14th of March decided to change the law to enable them to change the state of registry of this aircraft from whatever country they were in before to Russia, to have the RA registration instead. As soon as these aircraft are under the Russian registry, it means that the Russian authorities can now reissue these airworthiness certificates again, and theoretically these aircraft can continue to fly then, at least inside of Russia, providing that they can find another insurance company, probably a Russian one, that are willing to insure them and take on the risk. But that's only really the beginning of the issues that the operators of these aircraft are going to start facing. The next one is going to be maintenance. All of the aircraft that you see flying around every day, they are kept safe and in operating condition through a rigorous schedule of maintenance. This goes from a maintenance engineer doing a daily inspection, checking all of the major parts of the aircraft, and then as the time goes on and the aircraft flies more and more hours, it will be subjected to more and more rigorous maintenance checks, including taking the aircraft down almost to its bare components every 6 years or so. Aircraft components are basically divided into two different groups. You have the fail-safe group, which are either non-safety critical or it has many different components that can take up the load in case something breaks. And then you have the safe life components. Those components are often safety critical and they have a very specific lifespan. That lifespan tends to be dependent on, for example, the number of cycles that the aircraft has done, as in takeoffs and landings, or the amount of hours it has been used. And when the lifespan is over, as in when the calculated lifespan of that part is over, it is replaced, no matter if it is faulty or not. This is similar to your cam belt that you have on your car. You know how your mechanic tells you that, well, you're coming up to the amount of miles now that you need to change your cam belt, even though it's working perfectly. Well, this is exactly the same for all of the safety critical parts in any aircraft that you're flying. So this means that even though you might be sitting inside of an aircraft that is on paper more than 30 years old, you're actually surrounded by aircraft parts that are generally much younger than that. This is why the aircraft are so reliable and the aviation industry is so incredibly safe. But now we're also starting to get closer to the real problem that these Russian operators are going to face when they fall in behind a new iron curtain where they will not be reached by spare parts. Because the next thing that is so important when it comes to aviation safety and maintenance is actually how these spare parts and these components are being manufactured. Every single piece of an aircraft has a specific part number. It means that it can be traced. Even the smallest little bolt can be traced all the way back through its manufacturing chain, even back to the steel mill that it was made. And these spare parts are then put in and tracked through a global maintenance system. So if you take one bolt out of one aircraft and replace it in another aircraft, the engineer who does that job is going to have to go in and fill out the paperwork about which part was fitted to which aircraft, so that you can accurately track this. You've actually probably seen traces of this already, where sometimes there will be a news article about an aircraft manufacturer saying that they found a faulty part. It might be something that is corroding quicker than it should be, or that it's paint shipping off, or whatever it might be. Well, every time that they say that, they will also know exactly how many aircraft that are affected and where those aircraft are, so that they can contact the operators and tell them which part needs to be replaced. That is because these parts have been following this chain, right? At any given time, the aviation world knows exactly which spare part or where and how far along their safe life they are. Now, I cannot overstate how important that is for the overall safety of aviation, but also because it creates the most valuable commodity that the aviation business have, which is your trust. Without that, we cannot operate. Now, after this very short message from my sponsor, who makes it possible for me to sit here and make this kind of content for you, I'm going to tell you how this might be causing some real problems for the Russian operators. Reading text or watching video can be a really great way to learn the basics of a subject, but if you're like me, and I guess that you are, in order to really learn something, you need some hands-on practice. You need to really use the knowledge in order for it to get in here. And this is where the sponsor of today's video, Brilliant, is such a brilliant tool. Because Brilliant is an online interactive STEM learning platform that helps you to get a much deeper understanding of the concepts in maths, science and computer science by taking you through the subjects piece by piece in a really hands-on way. And as an educator myself, I really love how Brilliant is doing this, and I really enjoy using it. If this sounds interesting to you, which I really hope that it does, then the 201st of you who clicks on the link below, which is brilliant.org/mentor now, will get a whopping 20% off their premium 1-year membership. So go down and start learning today. Because of the sanctions that the West have levied against Russia, the manufacturers of aircraft spare parts are no longer allowed to sell these spare parts to any operators inside of Russia. And those manufacturers are the only ones that are allowed to make these specific spare parts. That's because the aircraft manufacturers, Boeing, Airbus, Bombardier, have certified these manufacturers to make these parts because they've gone through a rigorous certification process. Now, I've seen some comments on the video that I did last week saying that, well, Russia is a developed nation, it has huge natural resources, a lot of technical talent. Could they just be making these spare parts themselves? And the answer to that is, yeah, they probably could. But if the Russians would actually start to manufacture these spare parts and fit them onto their existing Western fleets, the second they do so, those aircraft would be essentially worthless. And that is because from that point onwards, it would be impossible to track the maintenance history of these aircraft. It would be impossible to know what type of spare parts had been fitted to the aircraft, when they were fitted, and whether or not they were of the quality needed in order to keep that aircraft safe. Now, you have to understand that these aircraft are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So it is very unlikely that any aircraft operator in Russia would be willing to see such a huge depreciation of the value of their assets. On top of that, I think that it's more than fair to point out here that the Russian major airlines and the Russian aviation authorities have been well on par with their Western counterparts when it comes to their safety records and their willingness to follow rules and regulations, and they are likely to want to continue that trend. So what can they do then? Well, the only real way for these operators to make sure that the value of their Western aircraft stays intact is to continue to follow the rules and regulations of the West. And the only way they can really do that is by starting to cannibalize, strip down their existing aircraft fleet in order to use them as spare parts. Because obviously, because of the sanctions that have been levied by the West, there's not a use for such a huge aircraft fleet anymore. Most of these airlines have far more aircraft than they need at the moment. So what they can do, if they have, for example, 5 Airbus A320s, is that they take 3 of them to the side, they start to pick them apart and use the spare part from these 3 aircraft to keep 2 of their Airbuses flying. Then hopefully at the end of this war they will have 2 aircraft that are still well within the rules and regulations, and the remaining 3 they can now start buying the spare parts to get them back into flying condition. Now obviously that is not a long-term solution. It's something that they can keep going for possibly a few months, maybe half a year, but very soon they're going to start running low on things like tires and filters and things that they need to replace on a regular basis. And then we come to the next possibility, and that is to try to turn to friendly nations that still haven't levied any sanctions on Russia and ask them if they can buy spare parts to these aircraft from those markets. It seems like Russia has already started doing this. Last week, a government official called Valery Kudinov went out and said that they had reached out to the Chinese, but the Chinese had turned them down in order to buy aircraft spare parts. Valery Kudinov was later very quickly fired, and the Russians said that no, that was not the case at all, which kind of further just indicates that that probably was the case, given the current information war that's going on. In that statement, Kudinov also said that they were now reaching out to India and to Turkey instead. So why would the Chinese have turned them down and India and Turkey be reluctant to do this? Well, that's because of the nature of the sanctions. If any country or any entity within the country would be seen to be breaking against these sanctions and be channeling spare parts into Russia, those countries or entities could also find themselves being subject to sanctions, which is not something that they want to risk. And that leads me to my next point, which is domestically built aircraft. The Russian Federation has, during the last few decades, started to focus on building some of their own competitors to Boeing and Airbus. You have the Sukhoi Superjet 100 and the very recently certified MC-21. Now, these aircraft are built and manufactured inside of Russia. And that means that if they need spare parts, those spare parts could also be manufactured inside of Russia. And since they can now be checked and verified, they would be just as legal as any spare part from any Western manufacturer. So that seems to work. But the problem is, of course, that both the Sukhoi Superjet and the MC-21 was built and developed during a time where collaboration between countries was a prerequisite for a successful and economically viable product to be built. So that means that even though the Sukhoi Superjet, for example, is Russian built, its APU, its landing gear and its flight control systems are not. All of those parts are subject to the sanctions. Now, could the Russians start making those systems and components themselves? Yes, I'm sure they could. But once again, that will take months or years to get a new supplier certified and to get these systems integrated and make sure that the aircraft still functions the way it's supposed to. So it's not a snap solution. So all of these things together brings us to the same conclusion, and that is that the Russian aviation industry can go in either of 2 ways. Either they continue to follow the rules and regulations of the rest of the world, which means that they will come to a grinding halt within a few months or so. Or they go down the route of isolating themselves completely from the world, making up their own system inside of Russia, using their nationalized Western aircraft, but by doing so potentially significantly decreasing the safety within Russian aviation. And I personally really hope that both the aviation authorities within Russia, which are really professional, and the pilots out there, the professional, my colleagues, will not allow that to happen. Now, before we end this video, I had a question from one of you guys on one of my previous videos, and the person asking the question said, wouldn't it be possible for the Western aircraft manufacturers to somehow remotely disable these aircraft to keep them from flying once they've entered Russia? And the answer to that is a resounding no! Because I can personally think of no scarier thing than a remote system to disable an aircraft. That is a truly horrifying thought. But what is true though is that software updates, for example to the FMC, to the Ground Proximity Warning System database, will not be upgraded in these aircrafts. Now check out this video next. I think you're going to find it really interesting, and if you want to see this whole series, then check out this playlist. If you want to support me and the work that I do, consider becoming part of my fantastic Patreon crew. They're a great bunch of people, or get yourself some merch. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.